As investigators replayed the footage, the air in the room seemed to tighten. This was the last known video of Sally Ann Bowman. Security cameras inside a local bar had captured her final moments. She was dancing freely, relaxed, smiling, enjoying the evening with her sister and friends. She was a young, beautiful woman, just 18 years old. A few hours later, when the night at the bar came to an end, she got into a car with her boyfriend and disappeared into the darkness. She would never be seen again. The investigation quickly became a brutal test of endurance. Detectives were forced to sift through thousands of leads, interview countless witnesses, and analyze every minute of surveillance footage, yet the answers continued to hide in silence. Every step forward came at a cost: time, pressure, and sleepless nights, as the truth always seemed just within reach, only to slip away again. What happened to Sally Ann Bowman? Let us take a closer look at one of London's most shocking criminal cases. Sally Ann Bowman was born in 1987 in Carshalton, South London.
When she was 18, she was an adult, and she was very streetwise, so, even if I had, there probably wouldn't have been many concerns.
She was the youngest daughter in a close-knit family. Those who knew her described her as warm, friendly, and emotionally mature beyond her years. She laughed easily. She spoke openly. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, even when meeting them for the first time. At home, she was deeply connected to her mother and sisters. Even after moving out, she never stayed away for long. Family was not something she drifted from. It was something she returned to, again and again. Sally moved into a rented room in South Croydon while she was still a teenager. It was a big step, but one she wanted. She was determined to support herself and build a future on her own terms. She worked hard, took opportunities when they came, and believed momentum mattered. To her, life felt like it was opening up, not closing in. Creativity was at the center of who she was. Performing was not a casual hobby. It was a passion she pursued seriously. Sally had been accepted into the Brit School for Performing Arts, a prestigious and highly selective institution. Getting in was not easy, and she understood what it meant. It was recognition of her talent, a sign that the dreams she talked about were not unrealistic. Alongside her studies, she also worked as a model, saying yes to any opportunity she could. She wanted experience, she wanted movement, she wanted more. To those around her, Sally was full of energy, bright, bubbly, the kind of person whose presence could light up a room without effort. She loved going out with friends, dancing, laughing, talking late into the night. At the same time, she valued quiet moments at home, especially with her family. There was nothing extreme about her lifestyle, nothing reckless, just the rhythm of an 18-year-old balancing independence, ambition, and connection. The day before she was killed did not feel significant. She spent it at her mother's house, resting and relaxing.
Sally Ann had woken up and just laid about all day in her pink fluffy dressing gown, watching telly, munching on biscuits and crisps and God knows what. And then the phone went a couple of times. It was Sister Nicole asking if she'd like to go out for the evening, as it was Nicole's best friend's birthday. It was about 6:05 in the evening on Saturday the 24th, and I went to the door. Sally just said, "Love you, Mum." I said, "Love you too." It was the last time I saw her.
A goodbye no one imagined they would need to remember. That night, she went where she had gone many times before. The town center, a familiar bar, familiar faces.
Sally Ann had gone out with one of her sisters and some other friends into Croydon. And Sally Ann had spent most of the evening up to the early hours in Croydon town centre.
I've seen the CCTV footage. She was at the bar, she was laughing, flicking her hair about, giggling, and according to Nicole, they had an absolute excellent night.
Nothing in those images suggested fear or danger. Nothing hinted at what was coming. As the night began to wind down, the energy inside the bar slowly faded. People drifted out in small groups, conversations slowing as exhaustion set in.
And at the end of the night, she went back home with Nicole.
Sally left with her sister and stepped back into central Croydon, the familiar streets offering nothing that felt out of place or unsafe. It was around this time that her attention shifted.
But in the meantime of the journey, she was having a conversation with Lewis on the phone and got it into her head that she really wanted to see Lewis. So she arranged to go get a cab from Nicole's back into Croydon, where Lewis then went and picked her up.
Shortly after 2:20 in the morning, Sally took a taxi back toward Croydon.
She was picked up by Lewis Sproston and he drove her back to Blenheim Crescent, which is where she lived.
Louis met her there in his car. What followed was not a brief encounter. Instead, the two remained together for hours, driving and talking through the early morning. Inside the car, the tone of the conversation shifted. What began as discussion turned into an argument. By now, the night had lost any sense of lightness or social ease. The streets were quiet. Most houses were dark. Any tension between them had nowhere to dissipate. It stayed contained inside the enclosed space of the car, carried forward mile by mile, minute by minute.
It was probably around about 4:15 that Lewis drives away from Blenheim Crescent, looks in his rearview mirror, and apart from the actual murderer, was the last person to see Sally Ann alive.
Sally walked toward home. Louis Sproston left. The street returned to silence. But later, investigators would return to this moment again and again. Sally was now alone, standing on a residential street just meters from where she lived. It was a place she knew well, a road she had returned to safely many times before. Nothing in the setting suggested danger. Nothing demanded alarm. And yet, something had changed. Just minutes after Sally stepped out of the car, a nearby resident was startled awake by a sound they could not immediately understand. A noise that tore through the early morning quiet and then stopped abruptly. At the time, there was no context to explain it. Only confusion, only uncertainty. What happened next would not become clear until much later. But in that brief window of time, between the car driving away and the street falling silent again, the course of the night shifted in a way no one could yet see. The street on Blenheim Crescent did not react. No lights turned on, no doors opened. No voices broke the early morning stillness. Whatever had disturbed the witness moments earlier faded quickly, leaving behind the sense that something had happened without being fully seen. Sally was no longer on the phone. She was no longer inside the car. She stood alone on a familiar residential road, only a short distance from the room she rented. On any other night, this would have been the final stretch, the part where the evening simply ended. Instead, time slipped forward without explanation. Later, the nearby witness described being awakened by a strange sound. This is how a detective would later recount it.
What we know from a witness is that about 4:15 that Sunday morning, the witness woke up because they heard what they described as a garbled sound, which ended in a scream. Now, they looked out of their window, which looked onto the location that Sally Ann was eventually discovered, but couldn't see anything. It was very still, there was no other noise. They left their window, but returned about 5 minutes later, hadn't switched their bedroom lights on or anything like that, and they looked out and they saw a man walk down the street in the direction of where Sally Ann was eventually found. They then didn't see or hear anything else and they went back to bed.
Inside the houses lining the street, people remained asleep. No one came outside. No one called out. When daylight arrived, the meaning of that silence became devastatingly clear.
It's about 6:30 on the Sunday morning when a neighbour saw what they described as a pair of mannequin legs sticking out from behind a builder's skip. They went over to have a look and discovered the body of Sally Ann, partially clothed and clearly dead at that point in time.
The scene told police immediately that this was not an accident, and not something that could be easily explained or dismissed. Officers arrived quickly and sealed off the area. The quiet residential street became a crime scene. The murder squad was called in. What followed would grow into the largest investigation London had ever undertaken at that time. While officers worked through the early hours of the investigation, Sally's family remained unaware. Detectives were tasked with delivering the news to Sally Ann's family. At her mother's house,
I heard the door knock and I just assumed it would be Sally Ann. I was sort of panicking, thinking, oh God, the door's all locked up, she can't get in. I looked out the bedroom window and saw two policewomen in uniforms and a guy in a suit. So obviously went downstairs, opened the door, and the gentleman in the suit said, are you Mrs. Bowman? I said, yes. He said, do you have a daughter called Sally Ann? And the first thing I said was, what have they done now? Because I knew the sisters had been out together. And he said, can we come in? So I said, yep. And as I walked around into the lounge, I hadn't even sat down. And the next thing I knew, he just said, she's been killed, stabbed to death. And I just remember screaming.
the shock was total. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. Sally's sister, Michelle, was informed shortly afterward. She would later describe feeling as though something inside her left that day.
I just remember this look in their eyes where you just know there's something that's not quite right. And they said, "Oh, do you know Sally Ann?" I said, "I'm really sorry to tell you, but Sally was found murdered this morning." And I remember something leaving me that day, and it's never ever come back, because she'll never come back.
The family faced the unimaginable task of formally identifying Sally's body. For a brief moment, Michelle thought it might not be her.
I went with Mum to go and identify Sally. I'll never forget. I just remember it standing in the car park out the back, and you can hear them wheeling her through, and that thing just taking over, just wishing that it's not her. I remember going into the room, and for that split second, I thought it wasn't her, because her hair was dark. And then I moved forward, and you just see a little button nose and a little freckle, and that was it.
Part of me didn't want to look. I could feel Michelle behind me, and as I looked round, I just fell to pieces. My Sally laying there in a black zip-up body bag up to her neck. Her hair all tied back off her head, where her hair they'd washed the blood from her hair. And I see a tiny wound to her neck. And Michelle was just screaming and crying, asking me to wake her up. "Please wake her up, Mum." And it was just horrendous. But all I could do was touch the glass. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near my daughter. And all I wanted to do was hold her and kiss her, but we weren't allowed.
By the end of that morning, Sally Ann Bowman was no longer a young woman who had not come home yet. She had become the center of a murder investigation. And the question investigators now faced was simple, but terrifying. What had happened in those few minutes on Blenheim Crescent when no one was watching? The answers did not come quickly. In the hours after Sally Ann Bowman was found, investigators focused on the narrow window between her leaving the car and the moment the street fell silent again. The scene suggested everything had happened suddenly. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle along the road. Whatever occurred unfolded fast, in a place that should have been safe. Sally had been attacked just meters from her front door. The forensic picture was brutal. She had been stabbed multiple times, wounds that made it clear this was a violent attack, delivered with force. There were also signs that she had been sexually assaulted after death. On her body, investigators found bite marks, small details that would later become critically important. From those marks, DNA was recovered. At the time, no one yet understood how significant that evidence would become. The street itself offered very little. There were no clear eyewitnesses, no CCTV capturing the moment of the attack, no immediate explanation for how someone could get to her so quickly, strike, and vanish without being seen. The silence after the scream had wiped away almost everything. As the day went on, investigators widened the net. Officers canvassed neighbors, traced movements, and listened for any detail that might have been missed in the night. The witness who heard the scream and later saw a man walking away became a key reference point, but the description was limited. A figure, a direction, nothing more. Attention quickly shifted to the last person known to have been with Sally. Her ex-boyfriend, Louis Sproston, had driven her back toward home in the early hours.
He was your typical teenage boy. He went out to work, he worked. He had a lot of respect for Sally Ann. They were the perfect couple. They were like the Posh and Becks. They had their moments. They were teenagers. They used to argue and bicker, but then who doesn't?
They had argued. He had dropped her off.
Very quickly, we identified her ex-partner, Louis Sproston, as someone who was a possible suspect. Murder detectives were given the task of basically finding Louis Sproston that afternoon. They managed to find him with a brother and a friend of his.
He was approached by police officers asking him if he was Louis Sproston. He said yes. And because he'd had a tiff with Sally that night and he'd driven off from the driveway, his story is because we've had an argument. Immediately, alarm bells, I presume, went off. And they said, "Louis Sproston, you are being arrested for the murder of Sally Ann Bowman." And he had no idea.
Here we had someone who had sort of acknowledged that he'd had some form of argument with Sally that night and literally put himself at the scene at the time of the murder. And there is only one way to manage someone like that with an investigation, and that is to arrest them as a suspect for the murder. And that's what happened.
He was identified quickly, located, and brought in for questioning. His DNA was taken. For a brief moment, the case seemed to be moving toward a familiar ending, one shaped by proximity, emotion, and timing. But assumptions are not evidence. While Louis was being questioned, the forensic samples were sent away for analysis. Investigators waited. The family waited. The entire city watched as details of the case spread across the media. Fear settled over South Croydon. A young woman had been killed on the very street where she lived. The idea that something like that could happen so close to home made people uneasy, checking locks twice, looking longer down roads that had never felt threatening before. Then the results came back.
It was a phone call from the Forensic Science Service, which basically said, Stuart, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we have a match to the DNA profile from your crime scene. The bad news is it matches to another crime, another sexual assault, 4 years before, only a mile and a half away in Purley.
A crime that had never been solved, a profile with no face, a name that did not yet exist. In that moment, the case changed direction completely. This was no longer the story of a breakup gone wrong. It was the story of someone else, someone close enough, bold enough, and hidden enough to strike without warning and then disappear back into the quiet. Once the DNA result landed, the investigation entered a different kind of urgency. The genetic profile taken from Sally Ann Bowman's body did not lead inward toward her personal circle. It led outward back into an old, unsolved crime.
The attack from 2001 was another truly horrific sexual assault on a woman. A lady who was in a phone box making a phone call when the suspect walks over to her, tries to get into the phone box and masturbates over the phone box.
He manages to get the door open and then ejaculates over the floor of the phone box and then casually walks off across the car park of Tesco's away from her.
That remained an unsolved police investigation, despite the fact that DNA was obtained from that crime scene. And I say it's the dawning realisation that if the attacker has done that 4 years before, and then 4 years later murdered Sally in a truly horrific way, what has he done in that intervening period? And if he has brutally murdered Sally now, what might he do tonight? What might he do tomorrow?
The case went cold. Now, 4 years later, the same DNA had surfaced again. Investigators were forced to confront a chilling possibility. If the same person was responsible for both crimes, then Sally's murder was not an isolated act. It was part of an escalation. The question was no longer only who killed her, it was how long this person had been operating without being stopped. As officers re-examined the final hours before Sally's death, another crucial detail emerged. Less than an hour before Sally was attacked, another woman had been assaulted on Sanderstead Road, not far from Blenheim Crescent. It was around 3:30 in the morning. She had just gotten home from work and pulled her car over. She was standing on the street.
This was a lone woman who was standing in the street on a mobile phone when she describes a lone male walking towards her.
What follows is how that survivor later described the attack.
He looked normal. He looked a nice young lad. I looked down and I saw a knife. And then he just looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry." And that's when he took the knife and he raised it up. And I just followed the knife going up in the air and I looked up and I watched it come down on me. He hit me twice on the head and he cut me across the face. And I then eventually put my hands up to protect my face and he cut me across the knuckle.
A taxi appeared at exactly the right moment, forcing the attacker to flee, but as he ran, he grabbed the woman's phone and tore it away. The call was still connected. The person on the other end of the line heard everything.
I'm very lucky. Things could have ended up an awful lot worse for me. And I feel guilty that I survived and somebody else didn't.
From the survivor's description, officers released an electronic facial composite.
We had a reasonable description. He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's of proportionate build, with short, dark hair. And then we had the local connection. 2 known attacks, plus the woman who was attacked earlier on the night, all in a very small area of Croydon.
Tips poured in, leads were chased, none of them led to an arrest. At that stage, police had a working list of roughly 22,500 names to review. They launched an enormous door-to-door operation, approaching around 6,000 homes in the area around Blenheim Crescent, trying to account for every young man matching the description who had been staying locally on the night of the murder.
We have so many techniques identifying people through forensics, but there is no substitute for knocking on people's doors and finding witnesses, and also finding potential suspects.
They also initiated one of the largest voluntary DNA screening campaigns in the history of London's Metropolitan Police. Investigators believed the offender was local, someone who knew the area well. Men in the neighborhood were asked to voluntarily provide their DNA, with the hope that even the smallest match could help tighten the net around the killer. Over the course of 2 tense weeks, nearly 800 men came forward to be swabbed, and every day it took place, Linda Bowman, along with Sally Ann's sisters, was there, quietly standing in the background, watching man after man walk through, waiting for the moment justice might spark from a single sample. The chance that the killer would volunteer was low. Even so, police hoped someone close to him might appear instead, a brother, a father, someone whose DNA might produce a partial match and point them in the right direction. Months passed. The pace of the investigation slowed. The fear stayed. A murderer had walked away unseen, and the city had no clear sense of where he was or when he might strike again. For detectives, the pressure became suffocating. In March of 2006, officers made a strategic decision. They would go back into the past one more time. They returned to the victim from the 2001 telephone box assault and asked whether she could now help produce an updated facial composite. It was released alongside fresh public appeals. With the family's permission, police also spoke openly about the level of violence inflicted on Sally, making one thing unmistakably clear: the man they were hunting was extremely dangerous. Then, far from Croydon, the break finally came. In Crawley, nearly 20 miles away, an unrelated incident exposed the identity of Sally Ann's killer. 9 months after the murder, a man was arrested following a drunken fight outside a pub in Surrey. CCTV captured the altercation. His name was Mark Dixie. He was arrested for assault and taken to Crawley Police Station. As part of routine procedure, his fingerprints and DNA were taken. He was then released on bail. At the time, police believed Dixie was responsible for nothing more than a simple pub fight. They had no idea how important that DNA sample would prove to be. His DNA was sent to the Forensic Science Service for processing. 12 days later, the result came back. It was a perfect match to the DNA found on Sally Ann's body. Up until that moment, Dixie's name had never come up in connection with the investigation, not once. The man identified by the match was 35 years old.
I think probably the first thing that probably went through my mind was, thank God, 9 months has been a long time for everyone connected to Sally Ann or to the investigation. And then it's the exhilaration of, we now know who he is, we now need to find him. Who is Mark Dixie?
It was so important to get as much information about him as possible. Where did he live? Where did he work? Was he married? Did he have any children? Where was he going to be so we could arrest him?
We received an email from the laboratory that we had actually a DNA hit identifying our offender, who we believed was our murderer.
When the call comes in, setting aside that short-lived feeling of elation, the big question then presents itself, well, where is he?
As police followed the trail, they discovered that Dixie was no longer in the country. After being arrested for the pub fight in Crawley, he had left the United Kingdom and traveled to Amsterdam. The timing immediately raised alarms. Investigators believed they had finally identified the man responsible for Sally Ann Bowman's death, only to find that he was now beyond their direct reach. Months passed before Dixie returned. After an argument with his landlord in the Netherlands, he came back to England and resumed work as a chef in a pub. That detail deeply concerned police. A man suspected of carrying out a frenzied knife attack was now working daily with direct access to knives. Surveillance was put in place. Officers moved quickly to the pub where Dixie was employed. When Dixie stepped outside the building, police closed in and arrested him. According to the arresting officer,
it was whilst this plan was taking place, we were walking through the car park at the back of the pub, walking to one of the side entrances. And that is when we realised we've identified Mark Dixie, we've had his photograph, we knew what he looked like. And that's when we immediately arrested him. It was during that arrest I actually put my hand, across his chest to make sure that he didn't run away. I could feel his heartbeat, and his heartbeat didn't even change. I had expected, some form of reaction from him. But I think it really just went to show what a chilling, detached individual.
Mark Dixie was taken to Sutton Police Station, still wearing his white chef's uniform. Inside the interview room, Dixie remained detached and uncooperative.
Tell me your full name, Mark Philip Dixie.
Seated beside him was an appropriate adult, a woman assigned to ensure the interview was conducted fairly and that Dixie understood his rights. She was a community volunteer, brought in to safeguard the process and help interviewers remain objective. Despite her presence, there was no connection.
Obviously, you're going in there and you're sitting opposite someone who has committed such a horrendous crime. You've seen the photos of what he had done to Sally, and it is hard not to be emotional, but you've got to ensure that you do your job properly.
Dixie stayed closed off.
Tell me what you know about the murder. No comment. Were you there at the time of the murder? No comment.
He was the same throughout, and that was one of the worst bits. He showed no emotion whatsoever.
She's received an injury to her hand, which tells us that she's grabbed hold of the knife while she's being attacked.
He viewed that photo for what appeared to be a considerable amount of time, looked at the ground, and again, no comment. And as soon as he did that, I knew he had committed that offence.
By the end of that night, Dixie was formally charged with the murder of Sally Ann Bowman, but the horror did not end there. To fully bring Dixie into the light of justice, police needed to understand everything about his life.
Mark Dixie was born in 1970. He lived in Streatham for a number of years before he moved to a children's home in Sidcup.
At the time of his arrest, he was the father of 3 children. He had separated from his partner and was renting a room inside the very pub where he worked. Friends described Dixie as larger than life, outgoing, charismatic, the life and soul of the party. Most unsettling of all, no one who knew him believed there was anything unusual about him. Dixie was prosecuted for the murder of Sally Ann Bowman. Later, he admitted to sexually assaulting Sally's body.
Mark Dixie's defence was that he wasn't the murderer. There was another murderer still unarrested, undetected, but he was the rapist, that he came across what he believed was a drunk girl laying unconscious in the street on the driveway, and he thought he'd seize his opportunity to have sex with her.
The trial took place at the Old Bailey in February of 2008.
When he was telling this to the court and the jury, with Sally's family listening, it really, with so much, and this is my phrase, so much contempt, as if to say, well, what's wrong with doing that?
I remember watching him he had no remorse on his face. He didn't care what he'd done. It was pleasure for him to see that we're all sitting there hurting. He didn't care. He just wanted to see us squirm while we sat there and listened to what he had to say. He's an animal.
Jurors heard the DNA evidence. They heard about the sexual assault from the year 2001. They also heard testimony linking Dixie to violent crimes committed in Australia during the 1990s, including a knife attack and a sexual assault that left a young woman seriously injured. What emerged was not the picture of a single, isolated act of violence, but a pattern that stretched across years and across countries. In the end, the jury rejected Dixie's account. He was found guilty by a unanimous verdict. The sentence was mandatory life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 34 years. It was one of the longest minimum terms ever imposed for a single murder in the United Kingdom. Dixie would not be eligible for parole consideration until he was at least 70 years old. For the court, the legal process was complete. For Sally's family, justice had arrived, but far too late to restore what had been taken.